the last king of Egypt once ruled over 20 million people and had access to genuinely unimaginable wealth, more money and more legitimate luxury than he could ever possibly spend across several entire lifetimes combined, without ever needing to take a single extra thing from anyone else. And he still, apparently, could not stop himself from slipping small objects and other people's belongings quietly into his own pockets, at card tables, dinner parties, state visits, and casinos alike, for practically the entire span of his adult life. His name was Farouk I, and this is the strange, oddly pathetic, at times almost darkly comic true story of how a genuine, deliberately trained compulsion outlasted an entire kingdom, an entire centuries-old dynasty, and very nearly outlasted the man himself. To understand how a genuine, legitimate king ends up compulsively picking pockets in exile decades later, you first have to go back to the very beginning of his reign, at a moment when almost nobody watching would have predicted any of this. Farouk became king of Egypt in 1936, at just 16 years old, following the sudden death of his father, King Fuad I, and inherited a throne he was, in many meaningful and lasting ways, not yet remotely prepared or equipped to properly handle. Remarkably, the young king was genuinely quite popular with the public at first, seen by much of the Egyptian population as a promising, modern, forward-looking monarch who might finally represent a real, meaningful break from his father's more distant, old-fashioned style of rule. He was handsome, photogenic, and relatively well-educated for a royal of his particular era, having studied for a time in England, and early photographs of the young king projected exactly the kind of confident, modern leadership that a rapidly changing Egypt genuinely seemed to want at the time. But underneath that promising, carefully cultivated public image, a much stranger, far more troubling pattern of private behavior had already quietly begun to take shape, one that had absolutely nothing to do with politics, diplomacy, or governance at all. From a surprisingly young age, well before he ever took the throne, Farouk developed a genuine, well-documented case of kleptomania, an uncontrollable compulsion to take and quietly keep objects that plainly did not belong to him, regardless of their actual monetary value or practical usefulness to him. What makes Farouk's particular version of this compulsion so genuinely strange isn't simply that he stole things. It's that, according to multiple separate contemporary accounts, he actually hired a professional pickpocket to formally tutor him in the technique, like any other skill worth mastering. In other words, this wasn't merely an impulsive habit that got quietly indulged simply because nobody dared to stop a reigning king. It was, at least in part, an actual skill he had deliberately, methodically trained himself to perform well. That deliberately trained skill eventually produced what remains the single most famous incident of Farouk's entire reign, and remarkably, one that had absolutely nothing at all to do with any policy decision or wartime negotiation whatsoever. During a tense wartime meeting with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in August of 1942, at the height of the Second World War, Farouk reportedly stole Churchill's own pocket watch directly off his person, apparently without Churchill noticing anything at all in the moment it happened. Farouk eventually returned the watch, later framing the entire incident publicly as nothing more than a light-hearted practical joke between two wartime allies, though contemporaries at the time widely understood it for exactly what it actually was. This wasn't an isolated, one-time embarrassment, either. According to multiple separate accounts, Farouk also quietly stole a ceremonial sword from the Shah of Iran during an official state visit, treating a foreign head of state's own royal regalia as simply another object worth casually taking home. By this point, Farouk had earned two telling nicknames that would follow him relentlessly for the rest of his entire life, whispered by diplomats and printed openly in foreign newspapers alike: the Thief of Cairo, and later, even more bluntly, the Pickpocket King. While this bizarre personal compulsion was steadily becoming something of an open secret among diplomats, journalists, and visiting foreign dignitaries alike, Farouk's actual political standing back home in Egypt was steadily, unmistakably beginning to collapse underneath him, piece by piece. British interference in Egyptian affairs remained deeply, persistently resented throughout his entire reign, and Egypt's traumatic, humiliating defeat in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War badly damaged whatever remaining credibility Farouk still held with his own increasingly frustrated, restless population. The same young man once celebrated across Egypt as a modern, promising monarch was now widely seen instead as distant, self-indulgent, and almost completely out of touch with the very country he supposedly still ruled. As his political authority steadily weakened year after year, Farouk's personal appetites, rather than becoming more careful, restrained, or cautious, only grew larger, louder, and considerably more expensive for the Egyptian state to quietly maintain. He became a genuinely heavy, high-stakes gambler, spending long, indulgent nights at Cairo's exclusive Royal Automobile Club and, increasingly as the years passed, at glamorous, brightly lit casinos scattered right across Europe's fashionable Riviera circuit. During a particularly extravagant 1950 visit to the famous casino at Deauville in France, part of a wider bachelor celebration, Farouk reportedly won and then just as quickly lost tens of millions of francs across only a handful of single, reckless nights at the baccarat tables. He would routinely rent entire 30-room hotel suites for himself and his enormous, ever-expanding traveling entourage, occasionally spending well over $100,000 in a single week purely on gambling, entertainment, fine food, and lavish personal comfort. Farouk's physical appearance changed dramatically right alongside his behavior over those same years. Once considered notably handsome, he steadily gained an enormous amount of weight, eventually reportedly exceeding 300 pounds, fueled by his equally famous, gluttonous late-night eating habits. By the early 1950s, the widening gap between Farouk's rapidly declining public standing and his continued, indulgent, deeply self-centered personal behavior had become genuinely impossible for ordinary, increasingly weary Egyptians to ignore any longer. Resentment toward the monarchy, and toward Farouk personally, continued building steadily beneath the surface for years on end, quietly gathering exactly the kind of momentum that eventually topples entire governments once it finally reaches its breaking point. That breaking point finally arrived on July the 23rd, 1952, when a group calling itself the Free Officers Movement, led by Mohammed Naguib and a young, ambitious officer named Gamal Abdel Nasser, launched a sudden, largely bloodless coup. Farouk was forced to abdicate almost immediately, formally handing his throne over to his own infant son, Fuad II, in a hopeless, purely symbolic gesture that genuinely fooled absolutely no one involved on any side of the negotiation. Farouk left Egypt for the very last time aboard his own royal yacht, the Maharousa, bringing an abrupt, undignified end to his family's long Muhammad Ali dynasty after roughly 150 continuous years of largely uninterrupted rule over the country. You might reasonably expect that losing an entire kingdom, an entire dynasty, and virtually all remaining political relevance almost overnight would finally, at long last, force a man like Farouk to genuinely change. It didn't. Not even close. Farouk spent his remaining 12 years living in genuinely comfortable exile, primarily splitting his time between Rome, the sunny island of Capri, and glamorous Monaco, still comfortably surrounded by considerable leftover personal wealth. He kept right on gambling, heavily and constantly, at exactly the same reckless pace he always had maintained before, almost as though losing an entire country had somehow taught him absolutely nothing at all about restraint, caution, or consequences. And, according to numerous contemporary accounts from that exact period of his life, he also kept right on stealing, still compulsively pocketing small objects, jewelry, and other personal belongings from the very people seated around him at casino tables and social gatherings alike. At one particularly notable point during these exile years, customs officials intercepted an astonishing 38 separate cases of jewelry that Farouk was personally attempting to move through customs undetected, a striking, almost absurd testament to both his lingering wealth and his seemingly bottomless, insatiable, compulsive acquisitiveness. The exiled former king now wore dark sunglasses practically everywhere he went in public, trailed constantly by a pair of bodyguards whose main job was fending off curious onlookers and persistent newsmen still endlessly fascinated by his strange, steadily declining life abroad. In private, Farouk continued pursuing an endless string of romantic relationships, reportedly becoming personally familiar with essentially every well-known call girl working in Rome during those long, comfortable, ultimately aimless years spent quietly drifting through exile. The very same compulsions that had quietly defined his entire reign as king, gambling, indulgence, and an uncontrollable habit of taking what plainly wasn't his, simply continued right on, completely unchanged and undiminished for the entire remainder of his shortened life. On the night of March the 18th, 1965, Farouk was dining at a restaurant in Rome, accompanied as usual by a much younger female companion, working his way steadily through an enormous, characteristically indulgent late-night meal of oysters, roast lamb, cake, and fruit. Partway through a leisurely post-dinner cigar, Farouk suddenly clutched at his own throat, said he felt faint, and collapsed forward across the table without any further warning at all. He was dead within just a few short minutes, apparently of a sudden heart attack, at only 45 years old. So what does the strange, almost tragicomic story of Egypt's last king, the trained pickpocket who briefly happened to also be a monarch, actually leave behind for us today? Farouk's compulsions were never really created by his power or his royal position in the first place. They were simply tolerated, quietly excused, and comfortably enabled by that power right up until the exact moment it finally disappeared for good. Once the throne, the wealth, and the total absence of consequences were all finally, irreversibly gone, the compulsion itself turned out to be the one single part of Farouk that actually remained fully intact, right up until the very end of his shortened life. Farouk lost an entire kingdom, an entire centuries-old dynasty, and nearly every last shred of the inherited respect and status he was born into. And through absolutely all of it, the one single habit he could never once manage to fully set down was the compulsion to quietly take things that were never actually his to begin with. In the end, the pickpocket outlived the king by more than a decade, and it's the pickpocket, not the monarch, that history mostly chose to remember him by, right down to the strange nicknames that still follow his name today.